Hey everybody. Given that this is a revision week for this first summer reading Q3, this 2004 prompt, I did want to make you a quick video, just kind of talking through some common things that I noticed from reading people's rough drafts, and just a little bit more guidance on kind of how I'd approach the question. And the first thing I want to say just before we get started here is a lot of you, you should not feel discouraged with this first attempt. Obviously, this was a challenge. It was meant to have you kind of go in cold without a lot of pre-guidance and see what you came up with. And some of you, I think if you're in the high 20s on your first go around at the very beginning of the year, that's a great place to start. And if you're someone where you've got a lot of work to do to get this thing polished up, it's the beginning of the year. That's kind of how it's supposed to be. So please don't get all in your head that this is a bigger deal than it needs to be. So I'm going to just kind of walk through kind of this prompt in relation to these five kind of subtopics because they seem to be kind of our main areas where people likely would have some questions. In terms of the length, I'm hopeful that by the time you watch this video, you've also watched that more general how to Q2 Q3 document that is right above this video on the video resources list. If you haven't, I honestly might just say you should pause it now and take a look at that before you go any further, because I'm going to kind of reference back to that a little bit. If you have watched that video, you know that they kind of give you some ideas in terms of structure, but not necessarily parameters. But one thing I did notice is there are some people in here that their structure is a little bit all over the place for this prompt. So just to be kind of clear, you do want at least 3 paragraphs. And by paragraphs, we mean like actual fully developed, like 5 to 9 sentence paragraphs. So like if you're someone that had like a 1 or 2 sentence introductory phrase before you kind of got to your body paragraphs, that structure is not necessarily prohibited. Like I'm not necessarily going to say, oh, you absolutely have to add more to that first body paragraphs. But if you're going to kind of structure it that way, make sure that you do still have 3 somewhere well-developed body paragraphs. Secondly, we're just going to kind of go through and kind of mark up this text a little bit and kind of try to decipher what it's asking. So obviously it reads, critic Roland Barthes, who, by the way, I will admit I had not heard of till we went with this prompt and had to Google search. Critic Roland Barthes has said literature is the question minus the answer. Choose a novel or play, and considering Barthes' observation, write an essay in which you analyze a central question the work raises and the extent to which it offers any answers. Explain how the author's treatment of this question affects your understanding of the work as a whole. Avoid mere plot summary. And then if this was the actual test, you'd have a laundry list of novels to choose. But for our purposes, we're keeping it to Fahrenheit 451, Things They Carried, or Great Gatsby. So kind of a lot to unpack here, right? But one thing to kind of be aware of is a lot of times they like to put in more than one task in one of these essays. They kind of view it as a way to verify that, I guess, that you didn't just get lucky, or that you can take a complex question with kind of multiple facets and organize it into something that is actually coherent without kind of overemphasizing any one. So let's start with the tasks, which usually come in the second sentence. So as you can see, what we've got here is kind of 3 things. The first task is analyzing a central question the work raises. Okay. The second is the extent to which it offers any answers. So I would call these in a way almost two different tasks, because you've got to talk about what the question is and to what extent it offers any answers thematically, basically. Remember, Q3s, it's always all tying back to theme. Like, what is it about what we're looking at that can be universal and something that can be applied to our everyday lives, or at least life broader than just the text itself. Then in this last one, it says, explain how the author's treatment of this question affects your understanding of the work as a whole. So in a way, this is kind of a third task. And this word treatment, that is kind of the broad term, because it's really going to kind of ask you here, not, like, what strategies are involved that actually lead you to this answer. So the way I would look at it is really there are kind of three questions here that need to be answered no matter which book you end up taking. The first is, what is a central question that is asked by the text? And I want to kind of add a word here, like universal. In other words, it should be something that's like worth thinking about. It should be something that is a question that we could ask beyond just the book itself. So it shouldn't just be like, why did X character in this book act the way they did? Like, it should be something that's actually, that would get us some mileage if we were going to have like a Socratic seminar or something like that, something that's a little bit broader. Then the second task that we kind of identified here is, to what extent does it offer any answers? So, like, I guess I would kind of boil that down to, how does the author or the text answer that question? And it's kind of literal. It's like, what's their actual answer to the question that's being asked? And then the third text, or the third question, sorry, is kind of another how. So how does the author guide the reader to contemplating the question and or the answers to the question? So obviously that's kind of multifaceted, right? But I mean, some of the things that we could think about here, different literary devices or plot devices. So we could go with anything here from symbolism to character development to character perspective. In other words, like whose thoughts we see, to length even of perspective, to even something like characters' interactions with each other, diversity of characters and personalities, anything along those lines. And we could probably add more to that list, but I don't want this video to become something that takes you, 35 minutes to go through. But you want to kind of keep in mind as you're going through here that there's the central question that's being asked, the answer to the question, and how we get to the question. Those are kind of the three parts of the prompt, the way I see it. Another thing that people have struggled with a little bit with this particular prompt is what to do with this quote. Like, to what extent to build your essay around it, whether you should acknowledge it at all, whether you should just kind of be like, okay, it's said, like, let's just get going. And, it's one of those things where there's no one size fits all answer to that question, unfortunately. I will say that the vast majority of these Q3, sorry, can't talk apparently, these Q3 thematic prompts, they will start with some kind of broad statement like this, where they kind of give you a quote to chew on. So really, some of the things that I'm going to say here, what to do with the quote, my suggestion it's honestly almost things not to do necessarily than things that you have to do. So one thing that I would not do is I wouldn't just drop the quote. In other words, I wouldn't just be like, all right, first sentence of my essay, Roland Barthes has said literature is the question minus the answer. I can guarantee that your AP reader, if they were back in 2004, if they had $1 for every essay that began that way, they could probably feed their family for the entire year. I mean, you want this to pop, and that is not the way to do it to differentiate yourself. The other thing that I wouldn't do is I would encourage you not to just ignore the quote. A lot of times, a lot of this is just making sure that you have the skills and capacity to actually catch all parts of a prompt. And so I also would encourage you to use the quote in some part of your intro paragraph briefly. So we'll add, don't ignore the quote. The third thing that I would say you don't want to do, and I know it's probably a little frustrating to get more don'ts than do's, but that's kind of how these work to some extent. The other thing that I would encourage you not to do is there's a couple people that wrote really good essays about that quote with like 5% of the essay spent on the book of their choice. It should be kind of the opposite. I mean, there were some interesting thoughts thrown out, but this is asking you to analyze a text thematically, not necessarily to spend paragraph after paragraph after paragraph integrating in that quote. So I would say never emphasize the quote at the expense of textual thematic analysis. And let's get rid of that. So a lot of times, what I would encourage here is I would encourage a short, and I do mean short, like 1 to 2 sentence, just kind of interpretation of what you see that quote as meaning. So in this case, I don't know. I kind of see it as kind of being something along the lines of saying good literature should be thought provoking, right? I mean, it's one of those things where I think it's kind of alluding to the fact that good literature, it puts the thoughts and the questions into your head that you should be thinking about as you read, that you can apply to your life. And then the extent to which it answers them, obviously, is going to be varied. But I think what you will want here is 1 to 2 sentences, not necessarily using it kind of diminishes your formality a little bit. To go, the quote and then be like, to me, this quote means blah, blah, blah. You want to kind of own your opinion. You want to make it seem like every logical person in the world that read that quote would kind of come to the same conclusion that you did about its meaning. Okay. So in your intro paragraph, you should have your thesis statement. And honestly, it's one of those things, if you don't have a good thesis statement, it's going to be really hard for you to get a passing score on that rubric. So it's super, super, super important that if there's any one part of the essay you're going to spend the most time, it's on this 1 to 2 sentence statement. So I would say ideally 1 sentence. Usually you're going to be looking for this sentence at the end of the intro paragraph and not in the middle. So that's one thing that I would kind of caution against if you lost points on the thesis section, especially those of you that might have had like a 0.5. A lot of people, you got a 0.5 on the rubric because it looked like you had a thesis there, but there was kind of too much stuff around it, and it wasn't at the end of the paragraph, so it was kind of hard to tell if that was actually what was going to be backed up. So I would encourage you to make sure that you put it at the end of your intro paragraph. And again, it should sort of have 3 parts to it, right? Because there are 3 tasks. So it should also tell me what's the central question, or a central question is probably a better way to put it, because most of these, there's multiple kind of thematic topics that you could go with. It should tell me whether there are answers, and it should tell us briefly or generally how the text answers the questions. Or I guess you could say what strategies the author uses to answer or cause the reader to consider the question. Okay. Now, honestly, most people, like, this wasn't an issue for most people of it seeming like you had no idea what you were talking about whatsoever. Most people, in your body paragraphs, there were moments of good insight and passages that connected to the prompt. Very rarely were there any essays where I'm just like, this is just, this is just off base or a misinterpretation completely. But the problem was kind of the structure. Like, people just weren't sure. Most people, their thesis only maybe had 2 of these parts at most. A lot of them only had 1 of these parts. And then it seemed like people kind of struggled with where to actually answer each of these questions. So the body paragraphs that I've seen that seemed the most cohesive, I've saw a few people kind of allocate 1 body paragraph like for each of these answers. I also saw some writers that kind of went through their text chronologically based on these questions. So they kind of almost went with, a beginning, beginning of the novel, what were the answers to these 3 questions? End of the novel, beginning of the novel, what was kind of the initial answer to these questions? Middle of the novel, how did it seem like things were developing? End of the novel, how were they finally answered, and what were we kind of left thinking about? It's not necessarily the only way to organize it, but I think that could be, for some people, a little bit more helpful than just kind of picking bits and pieces from the story at random, because it did feel like that was kind of an issue where people, they'd write like 1 body paragraph, and then it seemed like they just were kind of casting about for what to write about next, and they landed on something that may or may not have kind of been in the text, in what's the word I'm thinking for? My gosh, you guys, I'm sorry, my brain is a little fried. They didn't kind of go in a logical order. They didn't progress through analyzing the text from beginning to end. They kind of just picked random bits and pieces. And I'm sure the word that I'm thinking of is going to pop into my head and irritate me once this video is over. But I think that kind of explains what we're looking at. Lastly, the conclusion paragraph. So again, when you watch the other Q3 video, you're going to get not guidelines, but just kind of suggestions for conclusion paragraphs. And so unfortunately, it's going to be kind of the same from me. There's no one size fits all for like a good conclusion paragraph to one of these responses. And it's one of those things you have to kind of play the time, right? Like on the actual AP test, you're only going to have 40 minutes to get it polished up. And, you want to make sure that you leave yourself adequate time for the conclusion, but you don't want to do so at the expense of, substantive body paragraphs. So I would say that you should have a conclusion, obviously. I would strive to make the conclusion as close to a full paragraph as you can. So honestly, to me, it usually doesn't end well for people when they just kind of throw in one sentence. So as you can see, this text proves Roland Barthes' assertion that literature is the question minus the answer. That really adds literally nothing to what you've already done at that point. It's really kind of meant to be almost a so what paragraph. So where you kind of tie it back to contemporary events. Maybe what's going on in the world at large, something like that. And I mean, obviously, to some extent, you will have already kind of answered some of those questions in your body paragraphs, but it's just kind of time to bring it home once and for all, to not just kind of throw out a contemporary reference, but to kind of cement that, this is the essential question, and these are the things that the book asks us to think about related to that central question that we should be thinking about all the time, like as we go about our lives and order from Burger King and try to manage our temper and stop and go traffic with idiots and anything that kind of pops into your mind like that. I also would say it's a good time to circle back to the quote. Especially if you didn't do a lot of kind of circling to the quote in your intro paragraph. You do want to make sure that at least somewhere in the essay it's clear that you saw that quote, and that's been kind of the guiding thought in your head as you constructed the entire essay at this point. You do want to make sure that you restate your thesis in its entirety, but probably changing, I don't know, maybe 20% of the words with synonyms, just to avoid repetition. So, as you're kind of going through here, my hope is that that this video will be helpful and that it'll help you kind of look back at your first attempt and hopefully give yourself credit for what you did well without really any major guidance, and also give you some ideas of the things that you should fix. I do want to remind you, just while I've got you here on the video, that in addition to these video resources, you do have the actual rubric that is posted, that I used, and that's going to be kind of your Q3 reference rubric for the for all of this year. So I would encourage you to double check it, and kind of go through and be critical with yourself as you're revising in terms of whether you feel like you've moved up substantially enough in each of these criteria. There is also a video posted right below this one, if you haven't really looked much at the rubric yet, that is another AP teacher kind of walking you through some of the changes to the rubric when it went into effect last year. So with that in mind, please reach out to me if you have any questions or clarifications. I apologize about my brain fry in the middle, but I hope that you found this helpful and that it gives you a little bit more guidance as you're doing your revision. So good luck. Keep working hard. Appreciate y'all. See you soon.